Chapter 6. A small group of excited men greeted Pat Stevens on Main Street when he rode slowly back into town after directing the posse away from the direction that Ezra had taken. They crowded about him, asking eager questions as he swung off his commandeered horse. No one knew exactly what had happened, and the small town was flooded with wild rumors. Pat took time to explain the situation swiftly. Some guy robbed the bank. He broke in the back door. We had him surrounded, but he got to his horse and got plumb away. I followed him to the crossroads that's east of town, and there's a posse riding after him up the North Fork. They'll get him, I reckon. How come you're not with the posse, Sheriff? A curious voice called. Well, it seems the horse I was forking didn't seem none too fast. And I have some important business back here in the town at Jewel Hotel. Some of you fellas see about getting that padlock and chain back onto the rear door of the bank. I don't know how much money's gone, but maybe there's some still left in the vault that ought to be locked up. He turned away from them and then walked up the street towards the hotel, feeling the weight of the towel-wrapped death knife against his ankle with each step, a grim reminder of the role that he'd elected to play in a concealing of the murder evidence. Joe Dems and Kitty Lane were in the hotel lobby when he walked in. Kitty leapt up and demanded angrily, "Why do you have a guard posted at my door? What's all this mystery about, Sheriff Stevens?"
"What happened at the bank?"
Joe Dems cut in.
"We heard a lot of shooting, but no one seems to know whether you caught the robbers or not."
"We didn't. Not yet, but there's a posse after 'em." Pat turned his gaze on Kitty and said slowly, "About your room, ma'am. We'll go upstairs now and take the guard off the door." She tossed her head and said, "It's about time you let us in on the secret." And she and the hotel proprietor followed Pat up. Along the upper hallway, Harold Morgan was disconsolately squatting on one heel with his back against the wall between the two rooms he was guarding. He looked up with a scowl and slowly got to his feet when he saw the sheriff.
"Sounds like I missed a lot of fun," he grumbled. "What's in these two rooms that you want guarded, Pat?"
We'll find that out just as soon as Miss Lane opens her door," Pat promised him. "I want you right here, Morgan, for a witness to testify what's inside these rooms." He stepped aside politely and motioned to Kitty's door. "Go ahead, open it up." She hesitated in front of her door with a heavy hotel key in her hand. Light came through the keyhole from inside the room. She threw Pat Stevens a frightened look, then she caught her under lip between her teeth and slowly inserted the key into the lock. There was a loud click as she turned the key. She took hold of the knob with a trembling hand and opened the door. She took one step inside the lit room and then swayed back with a little cry of anguish, throwing one hand up to cover her face. Pat caught her by the shoulders and drew her aside gently to let Dems and Morgan view the huddled body of Fred Ralston on the floor. Harold Morgan whistled shrilly.
"A dead 'un? By goodness!"
He stepped forward to look down at the body wonderingly. Pat's gaze was concentrated on Joe Dems. The hotel proprietor stood very still, his yellowish eyes slitting downward at the corpse. First, there was a fleeting look of triumph, and then of slow puzzlement on Dem's face. He wet his lips and said hoarsely,
"What kind of game is this, Sheriff? What's that dead man doing there in Kitty's room?"
"That's what I'm wondering." He took hold of Dem's arm, drew him forward. "Take a good look. See if you can identify him." The faint sound of Kitty's sobbing filled the hotel bedroom as Joe Dems looked down steadily at the dead man. He wet his lips again, muttered,
"Looks like that Denver man that came in on tonight's stage. What's his name?"
"Fred Ralston," Pat supplied grimly, "as you know plumb well."
Well, that's right. That's the name he signed at the hotel register.
He looks like he was knifed, Morgan grunted. He was on his knees examining the body. Right through the heart, looks like.
Where's the weapon?
Dems demanded explosively.
You can't stab a man through the heart without using a knife.
Well, I reckon we better ask Miss Lane about that. Pat turned to the sobbing woman and demanded harshly. What'd you do with the knife when you stuck him? She didn't seem to understand. She shook her head in bewilderment.
The knife?
She repeated stupidly. Pat moved to her side and gave her a little shake. The knife you killed him with. It ain't here.
It isn't?
She sounded disbelieving, but somehow glad. She steadied herself and then went on rapidly.
Why do you think I know anything about it? You don't think that I...
She faltered with a look of horror on her expressed face. Well, he's here in your room, locked from the outside, and you got the key, Pat pointed out grimly.
I don't understand. Who is he? How'd he get in here?
Maybe he came in through this side door? Morgan offered eagerly. He got up and opened the door into Ralston's room.
Well, yes, sir, he reported. The door seems to be unlocked, and there's a suitcase and hat here on the bed. That's the room that was assigned to Mr. Ralston,
Dems put in sharply.
Number 15. I remember Tom Forrest told me he asked for that number in particular.
Now I wonder why he would do that, Pat mused. Being a stranger in town and all, I expect a lot of men would like to move into the room next to yours, Miss Kitty, but how did this man from Denver know which one to ask for?
How would I know? She cried wildly. I never saw him before. I don't know anything about this.
Dem's expression hardened. He circled the body and went to stand in front of the two chairs with the table between them. He pointed to the whiskey bottle and two glasses on the tray.
You better tell the truth, Kitty, he said slowly with his back to her. You're likely to get into some real trouble if you try protecting someone. This is murder, and it's serious.
She took a step forward with flashing eyes.
I don't know what you mean, Joe. If you think I...
Dems stepped aside, lifted his eyebrows.
You can see for yourself, Sheriff. Kitty was in here drinking with some man before supper.
Pat nodded slowly. Looks like it. Mr. Ralston, I reckon, he sighed. Sure looks like Miss Kitty ain't telling the truth. 'Pears to me she had it fixed with Ralston for him to come in here from Denver and then rent the room that was next to her. Then he must have come in and they started drinking and got into an argument, so she knifed him and then ran out and locked the door. That's the way it looks to you, Morgan? He asked the rancher, who was looking on with wide-eyed interest.
Well, sure does look that way, Morgan said importantly. He must have known her all right to be asking for room 15, and this here door was unlocked, and she was sure in here drinking with him while he was still alive. Well, don't you see, Kitty?
Dem's voice was like a savage whiplash across the entertainer's face.
This hick sheriff is going to hang this murder on you if you don't tell the truth and tell it fast.
Kitty Lane's eyes clung to those of her employer for a long moment, and then her gaze wavered down to the body of the dead man. She shook her head and said,
I don't know what you mean, Joe. Tell them what really happened. Tell them who drank whiskey with you while you were here. I drank it by myself, she flared.
Out of 2 glasses? Asked Pat.
Yes. She glared at him defiantly. I always drink out of 2 glasses, one in each hand. That way I can get it down faster. And the faster I get it down, the faster I forget what beasts all men are.
Tears ran down her rose cheeks, and she wiped them away angrily with the back of her hand.
"And you smoke lots of cigarettes, too,"
Joe Dems put in sharply, indicating the burnt-down brown-papered butts on the tray.
"Well, I always smoke a lot when I'm drinking two-handed."
Harold Morgan pushed his way forward to peer down with interest at the tray.
"I never seen you roll brown paper cigarettes, Miss Lane," he expulsed respectfully. "Only last night you turned me down while I was offering my brown papers, saying you was always using white." "You know you're lying, Kitty," Dem said wearily. "Sam Sloan was here with you tonight."
"By golly," said Morgan with interest, "I bet you're right, Dems. Sam always smoked his butts down short like this. Remember, Pat, how he used to laugh at Sam about burning his fingers on those short butts that he was always nibbling on?" Pat Stevens nodded heavily. "But there's also plenty of other men that do the same."
"Well, Sam Sloan is the sheriff's best friend," Dems reminded Morgan venomously. "Stevens would do anything to cover up for him, even to maybe hiding murder evidence."
Pat looked up at him with hard-alert eyes. "Meaning what, Dems?"
"Nothing."
Dems shrugged his shoulder.
"Only, as Mr. Morgan sees, right here's the evidence that Sam was in here tonight, and you're trying to protect Sam by claiming he wasn't here."
"I'm not claiming anything. I said lots of other men smoked their butts down short, and I'm waiting for Miss Kitty to tell us who smoked those."
"All right, it was Sam," she admitted wearily. "He came in to have a drink and a cigarette with me before supper. Is there anything wrong with that?"
"Well, go on and tell the rest of it,"
Dems ordered.
"That's all there was to tell."
Her voice rose wildly.
"We had some drinks together, then he went into his room, and I went downstairs to eat supper."
"Leaving your door locked?" Pat asked.
"Yes."
"And I suppose Ralston just walked in here and stabbed himself and then swallowed the knife," said Dems angrily.
"Maybe he did, I don't know."
Kitty Lane sank down wearily on a little padded bench in front of the Bordeaux and covered her face with both hands. "How'd that door come to be unlocked?" Pat asked her.
"I don't know."
Kitty's voice was muffled. She didn't take her hands away from her face. "Do you leave it unlocked all the time for convenience for someone renting that room?"
"Certainly not," said Joe Dems angrily. The Jewel isn't some kind of hotel, Stevens, and Kitty isn't that kind of a woman."
"Well, maybe not, but I still want her to tell me whether she unlocked that door on purpose, or whether it just so happens that it was unlocked."
"And I still tell you, I don't know. It's always been locked before. I didn't notice it today. I didn't have reason to look at it."
"Do you still claim you don't know Ralston?" She glanced at the dead man and shuddered.
"I never saw him before."
"And how come he asked for the room next to yours?"
"I don't know." Kitty sprang to her feet. "How can I tell why some man did something? Maybe he was superstitious about number 15. Maybe he always asks for number 15 at a hotel."
"But he doesn't always go through a door into the next room and then get himself killed. That seemed to only have happened this one time," Dems said harshly.
"I still wonder what happened to the knife that killed him."
He was regarding Kitty intently, and there was an odd note of anger in his voice. Kitty caught her breath, and sharply she said,
"So do I,"
in a wondering tone. Dems scowled at her and started to say something further, but Kitty turned on the sheriff and asked,
"Why do you know all about this? You've been acting mysterious all evening."
"That's right, Sheriff," Dems put in. "You asked Kitty downstairs if she knew Ralston, and you was dragging her up here to this room when you got the alarm about the bank being robbed."
That's right, Pat. Harold Morgan nodded his head with perplexity. You sent me up here to guard over these 2 rooms. It looks like you knew there was a dead man in here.
Pat hesitated. He wasn't ready yet to admit he had been in this room earlier in the evening. He was too cautious of having Sam's blood-stained knife hidden inside his boot for that. So he said gruffly, I got tipped off that something was wrong up here. That's why I came in the first place.
And who tipped you off?
That, said Pat, is my business.
Well, I think it's mine too, Sheriff. After all, I'm pretty much concerned about this.
Pat shook his head. A sheriff wouldn't get too many tips if he told where they come from.
Could be, sneered Dems, that you don't want to tell because it would mean to pointing that someone's guilty.
And what do you mean by that?
You know damn well what I mean, Dems exploded. Kitty admitted Sam was in here with her after supper, and they was drinking together, and he was pretty drunk, and also he's pretty crazy about Kitty. Now there's a dead man here, and Sam's disappeared. Looks to me like you're covering up for him.
Are you accusing of Sam of this murder? Pat asked flatly.
Dems shrugged his shoulders. It could be that Ralston came through that door while Sam was in here, and Sam was drunk enough to kill him thinking he was protecting Kitty.
Well, not with a knife, Harold Morgan declared. Not Sam. He would have gunned a man for that,
but he'd never use a knife while his gun was handy. Well, maybe he didn't have a gun. Maybe he left in his room.
Well, how about it? Pat demanded of Kitty. Was Sam wearing a 6-gun?
What does it matter? I didn't notice, I guess. I know Sam didn't do this. Well, then that leaves you, snarled Dems. Damn it, Kitty. Do you want that pretty neck of yours stretched at the end of a rope?
She stared at him, as though she didn't quite comprehend his words, and then smiled a bitter little smile.
I don't know. It might be a good way to end this crazy life. Nonsense, Dems said. You can't sacrifice yourself, Kitty. Damn it, a man would think you was in love with Samuel SLOAN. Maybe I am, said Kitty.
Dem's face became contorted with anger.
That ugly little runt? You're after his money. You know that's all you wanted.
He seemed to almost be pleading with her to verify his statement. She smiled listlessly and didn't say anything. For a moment's scowling hesitation, Joe Dems walked forward and shouldered her aside from her position directly in front of the bardo.
You're acting mighty funny, Kitty. Why are you staying so close to this bardo? You got something hiding in it? Something you don't want us to find? What do you think I've got hidden? A knife, maybe? I don't own a knife. Well, maybe it's somebody else's knife. Sam SLOAN's, maybe? It might have some blood on it.
Dems turned to Pat.
Don't you think maybe we ought to take a search there, Sheriff?
Pat replied, It wouldn't hurt. He stepped forward, and Dems drew back and folded his arms to indicate he wasn't responsible for anything Pat might find hidden in the dresser. Pat pulled the top drawer open and began rummaging through among a litter of feminine things, feeling foolish as he did so, but thinking that it would look better if he pretended to search for the knife that might even now be hidden inside his own boot. His eyes narrowed for a moment, and he drew out a small roll of parchment tied with a blue ribbon in a big bow knot. He held it up to Kitty and asked, What's this? Her eyes widened, and she seemed to flinch, but she said, It's nothing, just an old memento I've kept all these years. Pat said, I'd like to see what kind of thing you keep tied up with a blue ribbon, ma'am. His big fingers awkwardly fumbled with the knot, and he took a long time untying it. And when he finally rolled the sheet of parchment out, he studied it bleakly and nodded, muttering, I thought it looked like a wedding certificate. His bronzed features tightened, and he let the parchment roll back up. Kitty shrank back, with both hands going up her bosom as Pat turned to her. He said, I reckon it's time you started telling some of the truth, Ms. Fred Ralston. End of chapter 6.